4. First Station. When Steve took over driving, Marty was able to study the map at leisure. You could read it while you were driving, but only really effectively by means of the map screen, which picked out and illuminated a sector at a time according to the way you moved the wine knob. In fact, they had not bothered to put it through the screen. Steve had kept it spread out on a table. It was as simple as Steve had said. From the small circle marking the bubble, it was easy to trace their route up through the foothills to their present position, and as easy to follow it onwards to the point where it dog-legged between two peaks and stood over above the plain and the cross marking First Station. The last bit was through a warren of cross-hatchings which could have been confusing, except that they would be on the short run down to their destination. Any downward path took one to the plain from which one would see the dome of the station. The descent was shown as steep. They would need the spikes for braking. Not that it would matter if the crawler did lose adhesion and slide down. The vehicles were toughly built and well sprung to cope with minor impacts. Simple but slow. On a level, easy surface, a crawler could make 15 or 20 miles an hour. In terrain like the present, a third of that would be good going. They were 2 hours on their way out of something like 50. There were going to be dull patches during that time. They settled into a routine, taking turn about on the controls and the map. After 8 hours, there was the first rest period. Steve proposed throwing dice for who slept first, but Marty insisted that, having taken the first short stint, he must also take the first long one. Steve did not argue, but yawned and crawled into the bunk, zipping the curtain which ran the full length and left him in a soundproof and specially padded cocoon. The alarm was set to waken him in 6 hours. During that period, Marty was on his own. They were high but still climbing. The crawler was heading along a fairly straight defile with the sun hidden, but the earth a luminous crescent almost centrally above. The part he could see appeared to be covered with cloud. He wondered what it must be like, those short days that started, perhaps, in sunshine, and then the sun being hidden, rain falling. He'd seen it, of course, on films, but that wasn't like feeling it. Feeling rain, for instance. Drops of water, millions of them, falling out of the sky. It was all there above him, but 250,000 miles away. The thought of that distance, normally taken for granted, was suddenly overpowering. He was contemplating it not from the familiar confines of the bubble, but through the observation panel of this tiny, lurching machine, making its staggering way through the mountains that had never known cloud or rain for thousands on thousands of years. He switched on the radio for company and found a fairly strong station playing what he recognized as some kind of opera. It lasted for 1/4 hour before fading. He searched for another, but could not find one worth listening to. They were all so tiny and distorted that the sound merely emphasized his isolation. He let his fingers rest on the switch that would put the set on control frequency. He had a great urge to hear a voice that he knew, but if the voice were ordering him to turn the crawl around and come back, the thought made him feel a little weak at the knees. He snapped the radio off and concentrated on the track in front of him. Gradually, he grew more accustomed to being alone. Halfway through the shift, he took a hot drink and a packet of concentrated cookies and, making another search for Earth stations, found one that was strong and fairly steady. A man with an accent which Marty recognized as Australian was giving a cricket commentary. Lunarites had no interest in games that took up large areas of space, and he knew nothing at all about cricket. But it was comforting to listen to.
At the end of the over, taking the England score to 5 for 109. And yes, I think there's going to be an appeal against the light. The umpires are consulting, but they're not coming in. Shelton has the ball to bowl from the pavilion end. He's marking out his run now. 13, 14, 15, 16 paces. Pinkard takes charge. Shelton is coming into bowl.
An appeal against the light presumably meant that cloud was so darkening the sky that the batsman might not be able to see the ball properly. The crawler came out onto a wide shelf of rock and abruptly was in sunshine. It dazzled Marty's eyes until he buttoned the dimming blind into position. At the end of 6 hours, the bell pinged on both sides of the bunk curtain, and a few moments later, Steve emerged, rubbing his eyes. Marty showed him their position on the map, told him there was nothing to report, and took his place in the bunk. He zipped the curtain, snapped out the light, and stretched out, exhausted, on the mattress. The springs and foam padding beneath him converted the jolting of the crawler into a gentle, soporific rocking. Not, he felt, as he drifted into sleep, that he needed any rocking. His eyes ached from the strain of watching the trail of rock unfold. He could not remember ever feeling so tired. He came awake gradually and was surprised to find that he was lying in darkness. He could not recall hearing the alarm, and anyway, it should have automatically put the light on. Had he woken up before time? Yet he felt fully refreshed. He found and pressed the light switch and looked at his finger watch. Nearly 8:15. The alarm had been set for 6. Did that mean that something had gone wrong? The tracker was in motion, though, steadily lurching along. Marty unzipped the curtain and tumbled out into the cabin. Steve turned from the controls and said, "Hi." "The alarm didn't work. You should have called me." He saw the alarm switch on the cabin side. It was in the off position. "That was set when I went to bed. Did you turn it off?" "I thought you might as well have your sleep out." He looked beat. He knew it was unreasonable but felt angry, Steve showing him superiority. He could make out on the 6-hour bunk time that was standard on patrols, but Marty was presumed not to be up to it. He said sharply, "Why was I supposed to be any more beat than you? You'd been awake 6 hours longer, hadn't you? You insisted on taking the first long shift." That was true enough. His anger cooled, but left some resentment. He said, "Don't do it again without telling me, all right?" Steve grinned. "As you like, Skipper. How do you feel about making us some breakfast? Sunnyside eggs and crisp grilled rashers of bacon. It's the can in the corner on the right." Marty went to the food locker. He asked, "Anything interesting happened?" "What could?" Their course wound on through the foothills. As the sun slowly rose in the sky, they were in a harsh sunlight more of the time, which meant having to use the dimming blind, but also meant that the batteries were kept at full charge. For the most part, they saw only the walls of the valley or ravine through which the crawler was travelling, but occasionally there were glimpses of the high dazzling peaks of the mountains, and once, from an eminence, a view of the sea of rains behind them, though not of the bubble. They made one error by taking a wrong path into a cul-de-sac, which stopped them dead after 20 minutes. Marty was at the wheel, Steve navigating. The crawler faced a wall of rock in which, Steve pointed out, there were gleaming flecks of something that was not ordinary stone. "Gold?" Marty asked. "False gold, more like. But it might be worth making a note of it." If they were able to report an important new site for mining, Marty thought, the authorities might go a little easier on them. The crawler backed up to the point which he recognised as the one where they had gone wrong, and he stopped fooling himself. Nothing was going to get them out of trouble when they went back to the bubble. The best thing to do was not dwell on it. They had crossed the spine of the foothills and were descending by the time Steve went into the bunk again. The descent was not a steady one, of course. There were twists and backtrackings and occasional quite steep climbs, but on the whole they were heading downwards, and he was using the spikes from time to time to prevent a slide. Marty did not find the loneliness quite so overpowering this time, and the shift went reasonably quickly. At the end of 6 hours, Steve reappeared and Marty took his place. He was very tired again and dropped off right away. The alarm woke him and he came out to find the crawler heading along a dark and narrow canyon that dropped steeply in front of them. The walls were so close overhead that it was almost like being in a tunnel, and Steve had the headlights on to see his way. It was tricky terrain, as Marty discovered when he took over. Both lights and grip spikes had to be used frequently, and however much care one took, it was impossible to prevent the crawler's treads occasionally losing adhesion and the crawler itself suddenly sliding, throwing the pair of them against one or another of the padded interior surfaces. Towards the end of this shift, they came out into a broader valley where the slope looked moderate, but as he increased power, they were unexpectedly on scree. The crawler slithered for 50 meters before snacking up against a rock face. It gave them quite a shaking. Journey's end, when it came, was unexpected. Marty steered the crawler around a rubble slope and the sunshine was blinding ahead of them, reflected not off a few peaks or high walls, but from the great plain ahead. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the brilliance, and caught the gleam of something that was not rock, but man-made and symmetrical. The small bubble, no more than 20 yards across, of First Station. The suits were too big, but since they were designed to fit men of differing physiques, it was possible to wear them without much difficulty or discomfort. They went through the crawler's airlock and stood for a few moments in the shade of the vehicle before proceeding. It was not the first time Marty had been in a spacesuit. Children were trained to use them in vacuum as part of the bubble's safety program, but he felt different about this. Steve was silent beside him, for so long that Marty wondered if anything was wrong. Then he realised that he had not switched the suit radio on, and did so. Steve was saying,
"Go right in, or scout round it first."
The station's airlock was in the front of them and open. There had been no point in closing it when it was abandoned. No wind or weather could affect it. He felt a reluctance and said,
"Let's look around."
The perimeter was only a little over 100 meters in extent, which they could cover in a few minutes in float jumps. On the second, though, they halted. They stared together at the cairn of boulders, very bright in the sunlight, and the metal post in front of it with the small plaque on top. It had 4 names on it, the names of the men who had died here at First Station. 3 of them lay beneath the cairn in graves blasted out of the rock. Their bodies would be as they had been at the moment of death. Decay and corruption were signs of life, and the moon was lifeless. Mullins and Cattell, Sharp. Marty looked at the 4th name, Andrew Thurgood, not recovered. He knew the story from the books about First Station and the feature film that was still shown occasionally. Thurgood was the one who had taken out a crawler and not come back. They had searched for him but found nothing. He was supposed to have said strange things before he went. It was guessed that his mind had been turned by the stress of living on the moon, that he had travelled on until the batteries of his crawler were drained, his food and oxygen used up, and had died in some remote corner of one of the hundreds of thousands of clefts and gulches which covered the moon's surface.
What made them come here?
Steve asked.
What made anyone come here?
It was a question that was never asked, one from which the mind rebelled. Marty thought of Paul, wondering what he was doing now, out of the rehabilitation centre maybe, walking in fields somewhere, smelling flowers, feeling the wind against his face. He stared at the changeless scene in front of him.
Let's go inside,
he said.
There's nothing to see out here.
They jump-floated back to the entrance and went in. It was a cramped maze of catwalks and constructions, familiar from the feature film and yet utterly strange. It had been left when it was abandoned for the bubble, which was put up on the new and better site on the other side of the range, as a relic, a museum. And he had had the idea that it would look like the pictures of museums on Earth, with everything properly set out and labelled. Instead, there was clutter, the clutter, almost, of a place that people had just left and would soon be coming back to. Anything of value, of course, had been taken, anything that could be used, but what remained was much more than the bare bones. The basic structure in a garbage sack hanging from its wall hook, there were empty cans and cartons left from the preparation of the last meal eaten here. The tomato sauce and solitary bean at the bottom of one of the cans had frozen and thawed again, each 14-day cycle, over more than half a century, but, since there were no bacteria, had not changed in all that time. On the floor, Marty saw a chewing gum wrapper and a plastic button. Steve was picking something up from one corner. He said through the radio,
What's that?
Steve's voice buzzed back at him.
A camera. Why would they leave that? I get it. It's broken. Smashed, in fact. Not only the lens, the casing as well. That bit in the film,
Marty said.
Where Anketel saved Stenberg when he slipped down the fissure. Didn't he drop his camera then? I suppose they brought it back, and then realised it was beyond mending.
Steve turned the camera over in his hands.
Could be. Something has certainly hit it hard at some point. The drop was more than 50 metres.
Steve said.
You know all that stuff, don't you? Well, don't you?
Steve nodded.
Like I know the cabin route between the apartment and school. I wouldn't say it stirs the imagination.
Marty left him and climbed a catwalk to the top chamber, the observatory. The telescope they had used was still there. He looked through the eyepiece without moving it and saw, as he had guessed would be the case, that it was trained on the distant Earth, latitude around 40 degrees north, at the moment the hazy coastline of Japan, but that was the latitude of part of the United States too. Someone, perhaps, taking a last look at home before the move out. Leaving First Station as it was had not been merely a sentimental gesture. Even then the priorities of lunar life had been clear. No waste, no needless effort. A lot of the structures could have been dismantled and shifted, but the energy consumption would have been too high. The telescope, probably, that would have been taken, except that the genevoscope had come in around that time and rendered old-fashioned optical instruments obsolete. The sleeping quarters were below ground level, light switches and fittings were in place and undamaged, but there was no power. Marty could hear Steve moving around somewhere but could not see him. He activated the suit lamp, broadening the beam to diffuse the light. There were the bunks, a table, shelves, no books. They would have been taken. But some pin-ups on the walls, girls mostly, but some of the landscapes. A slanting meadow with belled cows beneath a dazzling slope of snow. A sea coast with twisted ochre rocks and a fantastic grey overhanging wave. And on one side of the shelves, a photograph wallet which, opened, showed on one side a woman smiling under a big summer hat. On the other, a big black dog with a boy beside him. The boy was about 3, dressed in shorts and shirts out of a historical film. He wondered why the photograph had been abandoned and realised it was probably because it had belonged to one of the men who lay outside under the cairn 70 years ago. The boy would be an old man now, if he was still alive. He lay on one side of the bunks, staring at the ceiling, which pressed close down on him. It was no worse than sleeping in a crawler bunk, but that was for a few nights. A week, maybe. 3 years had been the shortest time any of the colonists had spent here. The bunk was of metal, enclosing broad strips of intertwined plastic, much less resilient than the kind they use now. It had been bolted to the wall, and there was a small gap, no more than half an inch, at the side. He twisted round, getting up, and the beam from his suit lamp lit for a moment and showed something there. He peered and could distinguish it better. A thin book? He pulled the side of the bunk, but it was immovable. It was impossible to get at it with his spacesuit fingers. Even without the awkwardness of mittens, the gap would have been too small. It could not be anything important anyway. He left the bunk, abandoning it, and then found himself drawn back. He studied the crack more closely. If one could get something long and thin, it might be possible to hook it out. The bunks had angle irons reinforcing their corners, strips of steel some 20 centimeters by 2. He got one off, using the screwdriver attachment of the multi-tool on his belt. Then, he began the fishing operation. It was not easy. Once he thought he had got the book, only to have it slip even further down. He almost abandoned the idea. The strip of metal was awkward to use and he felt himself sweating inside the suit. It would be good to get back in the crawler and rub a cleansing pad over him. He decided he would make one more effort, and when that failed, gave himself an absolutely final one. It was 2 attempts after that before he managed to get the steel firmly under the object and lifted it clear. It was a notebook, the leaves paper and not plastic. He fumbled it open and saw that it was in the nature of a log or journal. There was an entry. Day 402. Crawler duty with Barney. Nothing to report. At least he doesn't talk all the time like Mike. Got back to find that stupid argument about the weight of a seagull still going on. Everyone talking, even Lou in it now. They could settle it in a few minutes by sending a signal back requesting information, but I suppose they think that that would cause alarm or something. And they don't want to settle it anyway. If they did, there would be nothing to argue about. My weight today, 167 pounds, -1. Due for a haircut. Can't be bothered to fix it with Barney. He flipped the pages and read a couple more entries, which seemed as dull and trivial as the first. He thought of leaving the journal here, where it belonged, and then decided Steve might like to look at it. He wedged it into his suit pouch and started up the ladder. Steve's radio came through to him as he reached the ground level.
You've got to go. You've got to, Marty. I'm here,
He said.
I've been down below. Anything there? Nothing much. You find anything? Only lumber. We could give it a rest for now. I could do with a rub down.
Steve nodded, awkwardly in the suit.
A drink too. Let's go.